Welcome to today's deep dive. We're really glad you're here with us.
Yeah.
On August 9th, 1945, the atomic bomb dropped on Nagasaki.
Right.
And conventional history kind of tells us that this was the definitive end of something, the flash, the shockwave, the surrender.
Just a clean break.
Yeah, a very neat textbook ending to the war.
Exactly. But if you look at the stack of translated investigative reports and historical texts we are diving into today, a very different picture emerges. They argue that the long night in Nagasaki didn't end. It just lengthened.
Wow.
Yeah, it basically stretched out over decades, crossed continents, and just evolved. So our mission today is to pull apart this very specific, decades-old playbook used by powerful entities to hide catastrophic environmental contamination.
That is a fascinating mission, honestly.
It really is.
Yeah.
We're going to trace how this strategy of absolute silence, which is born in the ashes of World War II, didn't actually stay in the past. According to the sources, it is actively being deployed right now, today, in modern corporate Brazil. The historical parallel we're looking at here is just staggering because it begins with a highly calculated choice by the United States military. Following the bombings in Japan, the U.S. desperately needed the world to focus on one single thing.
Which was the explosive power.
Exactly. The surgical, overwhelming, explosive power of the weapon. The narrative they wanted was this clean, almost clinical annihilation that forced peace.
Right, the whole we did what we had to do angle.
Yeah, exactly. But to maintain that narrative, they had to systematically hide the invisible aftermath. I mean, the radiation that was actively seeping into the groundwater, poisoning the soil, and, breaking down the bodies of the survivors long after the actual fires were put out.
And the sources pinpoint the architect of this cover-up, which is General Leslie Groves. He was the head of the Manhattan Project.
He was.
And the texts point out this wasn't just some passive administrative oversight where paperwork got lost in a filing cabinet. Groves was terrified of public opinion.
Oh, absolutely terrified.
Right. Because if the American public, and the world at large, understood the gruesome, lingering reality of radiation poisoning, the moral high ground the U.S. claimed would just evaporate. The bomb would be viewed not as a decisive military tool, but as an indiscriminate weapon of mass torture.
So he instituted a censorship campaign that was, incredibly aggressive and mechanically thorough. Groves didn't just ask people not to talk about it. His department actively confiscated the biological evidence.
Wait, they took the actual biological evidence?
Yeah, they swept right into Japanese hospitals and seized medical reports. They confiscated physical biopsies from the victims.
Oh my.
They even seized documentary film reels shot by Japanese crews who were trying to chronicle the devastation on the ground. And Groves justified this massive suppression of scientific data under the convenient umbrella of combating Japanese propaganda.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because the way they manipulated the press is basically a masterclass in narrative control.
Yeah.
You have Wilfred Burchett, right, an Australian correspondent who was one of the very first journalists to physically get into Hiroshima.
Right, a really crucial figure.
And he writes this visceral, harrowing account describing an atomic plague. He's walking through these hospitals, seeing people dying with absolutely no external injuries, like no burns, no shrapnel wounds, just deteriorating internally from what we now know was acute radiation syndrome.
And Burchett's reporting threatened the entire carefully constructed military narrative. So General MacArthur's response was immediate. He expelled Burchett from Japan entirely.
Just kicked him out.
Just kicked him out, and publicly branded his reporting as a complete fabrication. They discredited the eyewitness to protect the policy.
But then, to fill that information vacuum, the military essentially installed their own narrator, William L. Lawrence.
Yes, the New York Times guy.
Right, a highly respected science reporter for the Times. But what the public didn't know was that Lawrence was secretly on the Pentagon's payroll.
Which is just wild to think about.
It is. He had literally been drafting press releases for the War Department. Lawrence becomes the official voice of the atomic age for the American public. And he writes these front-page articles assuring readers that there is absolutely no dangerous radioactivity left in the soil.
Yeah, he even went so far as to describe radiation exposure as a rather pleasant way to die.
Which is insane. It's basically like a doctor trying to convince you that a lethal poison is actually a refreshing new energy drink.
That's a perfect analogy, honestly. It's an astonishing piece of historical gaslighting. Lawrence leveraged the institutional credibility of the New York Times to essentially launder a military cover-up.
Exactly. When you have a closed-loop information system like that, the public doesn't stand a chance.
But this clinical logic established here is what makes this history so relevant to us today. The U.S. government realized that if you control the data, you can treat the victims of invisible contamination as mere statistical inconveniences. The greater good of national security justified burying the side effects. And once that bureaucratic machinery is built, it doesn't just dismantle itself when the war ends. That exact same logic of acceptable casualties was seamlessly redirected inward against American citizens.
Which takes us out of Japan and into the Navajo Nation in New Mexico during the Cold War. The U.S. Atomic Energy Commission is in this dead sprint against the Soviet Union.
The arms race.
Right. They need to build a massive nuclear arsenal, which means they need uranium, and they need it immediately. So they turn to the sacred Navajo lands where uranium deposits are rich.
And they hire local Navajo men to go into these mines.
But they give them no warnings about the radiation. Like, absolutely none. They don't provide proper ventilation in the shafts, and they offer zero protective equipment.
The mechanics of the exposure here are brutal. After blasting the rock, the miners were sent directly into the unventilated shafts. They were inhaling high concentrations of radon gas. And when radon decays, it leaves behind solid radioactive isotopes that embed directly into the lung tissue. So the doctors on the reservations began seeing the exact same biological devastation that was documented in Hiroshima.
The exact same thing.
Yeah, generations of Navajo people developed severe respiratory diseases, aggressive cancers, and an alarming spike in birth defects.
See, I want to try to understand the internal calculus of the people running this, because it's hard to wrap your head around. It's the late 1940s and 50s. The military already has the confiscated biopsies from Japan sitting in a drawer somewhere.
Right, they have the data.
They know exactly what this mysterious disease X does to the human body. Wait, so they literally watched the Japanese wither away from this mysterious disease X, saw the exact same thing happening to Navajo miners back home, and still chose silence. How do they even begin to justify that internally?
It comes down to the brutal math of the Cold War economy. The U.S. was operating under an existential panic regarding Soviet nuclear capabilities. In that framework, protecting marginalized indigenous miners was viewed as an unacceptable friction on the supply chain.
A friction. That's so grim.
It is. If they admitted that mining uranium required expensive safety protocols, massive ventilation systems, and hazard pay, it would slow down the production of the arsenal. So the silence was an economic and strategic necessity. You normalize the contamination as the cost of doing business.
And you rely on the geographic and political isolation of the Navajo Nation to keep the consequences out of the national headlines.
Exactly, and that geographic isolation plays a massive role when things inevitably go wrong. The sources detail the 1979 Church Rock disaster, which really drives this point home.
The dam collapse.
Yeah. The dam at the Church Rock uranium mill collapsed, sending an estimated 94 million gallons of radioactive tailings and contaminated water straight into the Puerco River.
Just massive.
To understand the sheer scale of that, this single spill released more radiation into the environment than the 3 Mile Island accident.
Unbelievable.
And those two events happened in the exact same year.
But the national response couldn't have been more different. I mean, 3 Mile Island happens in Pennsylvania, threatening the East Coast, and becomes a global symbol of nuclear anxiety. Movies are made about it. Policy changes.
Yep.
Church Rock happens on a Navajo reservation, poisoning the primary water source for an entire population, and the government essentially looks the other way. The waters became permanently toxic, mirroring the rivers of Hiroshima. It is the ultimate proof that the government's response to contamination is entirely dependent on who is being contaminated.
And the strategy of silence only breaks when the human element becomes impossible to ignore. That's the turning point the text highlights, with John Hersey's landmark 1946 article, simply titled Hiroshima, published in The New Yorker.
Such an important piece of journalism.
It really was. Hersey didn't argue about radiation statistics or geopolitical strategy. He bypassed the military censors by focusing entirely on the visceral day-to-day survival of 6 specific individuals. He detailed the slow, agonizing deaths, the hair falling out, the inexplicable bleeding.
And the Truman administration completely panicked. They had successfully hidden the abstract concept of radiation, but they couldn't hide the human suffering once it was put in front of the American public in such a relatable way.
No, they couldn't.
Hersey's piece became a cultural phenomenon because it broke through the administrative erasure.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it proved that the truth about prolonged contamination, the kind that taints breast milk, deforms fetuses, and degrades bone marrow years after exposure, it acts as an implacable messenger.
Right.
Water and soil don't respect government NDAs or military classifications. Eventually, the physics and biology of the contamination will reveal themselves.
And that realization is basically the pivot point of our deep dive today. Because the sources make a compelling argument that when the Cold War ended, this playbook didn't just go away.
Far from it.
The strategy of silencing victims to protect an economic engine was simply too effective to abandon. So it migrated. It evolved from a tool of the military-industrial complex into a blueprint for modern corporate pollution.
The geography and the players change, but the methodology is a direct continuation. We see this currently unfolding in Camaçari, in the state of Bahia, Brazil. Specifically, the texts point us to a community called Arias, which sits near a chemical company named Tronox that has operated in the region for over 5 decades.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because Arias has essentially become an involuntary testing ground for industrial runoff. The investigative reports include forensic data from the Public Prosecutor's Technical Support Center, utilizing tests from INEMA, which is the local environmental institute there.
Right.
And they map the groundwater that the community of Arias relies on daily.
And the findings are severe. The groundwater is saturated with heavy metals, specifically highly dangerous concentrations of nickel, lead, cobalt, and chromium.
Okay, let's break down why those specific metals are so terrifying. We often hear the term heavy metals, but what does that actually mean for the human body? The sources note these are classified as type 1 carcinogens by the International Agency for Research on Cancer.
And a type 1 classification means this isn't it isn't a theoretical risk. There is proven, undeniable evidence that these substances cause cancer in humans.
Wow.
At a cellular level, heavy metals are insidious because they often mimic essential nutrients. Your cells are tricked into absorbing them. Once inside, metals like hexavalent chromium or nickel begin shattering DNA strands and disrupting cellular division.
Just tearing the cells apart.
Literally.
Yeah.
Nickel exposure is directly linked to acute leukemia and lung cancer. Lead toxicity targets the renal system, leading to aggressive kidney tumors.
And the people of Arias are interacting with this water constantly. They drink it, they cook their food in it, they bathe their children in it. The text described the result as a silent epidemic. We're talking about unexplainable spikes in pneumonias, chronic kidney failures, and rare cancers tearing through families.
What's fascinating here is how Tronox is managing this epidemic. It connects them directly back to General Groves in 1945. The investigative reports deconstruct the corporate strategy into a lethal triad: silence, corruption, and disinformation.
Basically a copy-paste of the 1945 manual.
Exactly. It is the exact same architecture of denial, just updated with modern public relations. To really grasp how a company can get away with this today, we have to look at the mechanics of each of those 3 pillars.
Yeah, let's start with the first pillar. Silence is policy. In the age of smartphones and the internet, how do you keep a mass poisoning quiet? Well, you do it through legal attrition and bureaucratic starving.
Right.
The texts outline a specific mechanism here. Back in 2012, Tronox signed something called a TAC, a conduct adjustment term. Now, for you listening, a TAC in the Brazilian legal system is essentially a binding settlement where a company agrees to alter its behavior and monitor its impact to avoid immediate litigation.
On paper, it looks like accountability. The TAC promised rigorous sanitary and environmental monitoring of the Arias area. But here is the mechanism of the silence. The municipal and state authorities responsible for actually executing that surveillance simply stopped doing it.
They just stop.
Yeah, they claimed a lack of resources, or they just let the schedule lapse.
Which creates a deliberate data void. Like, if you don't test the water isn't polluted.
Right.
If you don't track the cancer clusters don't exist. So when a resident of Arias dies from complications related to heavy metal poisoning, there is no scientific baseline to connect it to the factory.
Exactly.
The death certificate just reads natural causes. It's the exact same administrative erasure used on the Navajo miners. No monitoring means no problem.
Which naturally requires the second pillar to function: corruption as a shield. For the state to ignore a binding agreement like the TAC, there has to be profound regulatory capture. The state begins to view its own citizens as the friction and the corporation as the asset.
That is so disheartening.
The source material highlights a highly revealing moment from a local state deputy. When he was publicly confronted with undeniable reports of childhood cancer in the area's community, his immediate response was to declare, "Tronox is not our enemy."
It's incredible to hear a politician say the quiet part out loud like that. It lays bare the entire structural dynamic.
Yeah.
The municipality relies on the tax revenue and the jobs provided by the chemical plant. They literally cannot afford to regulate them.
No, they can't.
So the politicians run interference, allowing the company to focus on polishing its public image. The texts point out that Tronox routinely wins best-in-sector corporate awards and advertises its internal quality-of-life programs for its executives, all while venting toxic emissions a few miles from where mothers are burying their children.
The cognitive dissonance is staggering, but it's held together by the final pillar: disinformation as a weapon. When the physical evidence of the contamination becomes too obvious to completely ignore, the company deploys a strategy of deflection that directly blames the victims.
And this is the part of the report that really stopped me in my tracks. The community's water literally comes out of the tap white,
Yeah.
visibly clouded with chemical contaminants. And Tronox's official corporate stance is that this contamination has absolutely nothing to do with their massive industrial chemical operations.
Right.
Instead, they issue statements blaming the pollution on a lack of basic sanitation in the community. They claim it's due to cesspool leaks from the residents' own homes.
Yeah.
Hold on. So the residents turn on their taps, the water literally comes out white, and the company's official line is to gaslight these poisoned people into believing it's their own fault for having a sewage problem. I'm trying to process the sheer audacity of this PR spin.
That's extremely bold.
They are looking at a marginalized community with underdeveloped infrastructure. And instead of taking responsibility for the heavy metals, they're using the community's poverty as a weapon against them. They're essentially saying, your water is toxic because you're dirty,
Yeah.
completely ignoring the fact that human sewage does not spontaneously synthesize industrial-grade cobalt and chromium.
It is a grotesque manipulation of reality, but mechanically, it works. It provides just enough plausible deniability for the state to avoid taking action. This raises an important question, and it reveals the dark thread connecting all of these events from Hiroshima to Church Rock to Bahia.
Yeah.
The underlying structural assumption is that the suffering of poor, marginalized, racialized, or indigenous populations can simply be managed. Powerful entities believe they can delay the reports, publish contradictory statistics, and rely on the slow grind of the legal system to simply wait out the victims.
But the people of areas aren't just waiting to die quietly. The texts highlight an incredible resistance forming on the ground. Much like the Hibakusha, the survivors of Hiroshima who relentlessly documented their own suffering, the residents of areas are building their own archive of evidence. They are bypassing the government entirely.
The community is meticulously saving every pharmacy receipt, every hospital bill, every medical record, creating a grassroots database of the epidemic. They are even leveraging artificial intelligence, generating videos to give faces and voices to their deceased loved ones.
That is so powerful.
They are refusing to let their family members be reduced to anonymous natural causes on a state ledger.
They are forcing the human element into the light, just like John Hersey did in 1946. But they are fighting a justice system designed to exhaust them. There is a lawsuit detailed in the reports, filed by 43 families against Tronox, demanding accountability. That lawsuit has been stalled in the Commissary Forum for 18 years. It has just been sitting in legal purgatory.
And that specific number, 18 years, carries a grim historical irony. Because 18 years is exactly how long it took the United States government to finally, timidly admit that radiation exposure in Japan caused long-term genetic and cellular damage, retracting the lies they sold the public in 1945.
Wow.
Yeah. It took nearly 2 decades for the truth to pierce through the official silence back then, and these families in Brazil are being forced to wait just as long for basic acknowledgement today.
There is a quote from the investigative text that really anchors everything we've unpacked today. The author writes, "Silence is not the absence of sound. It is the noise of money being counted while bodies rot."
That perfectly encapsulates the mechanism we've been tracking.
Yeah.
The playbook relies on the illusion that money and PR can alter physical reality. But the texts remind us that water is an implacable messenger.
Right.
You can buy off a politician, you can stall a lawsuit for 2 decades, and you can win endless corporate awards. But heavy metals in the aquifer do not lie. The biology of the contamination will always outlast the public relations campaign.
So what does this all mean for you, listening right now? Why should you care about a censored military report from the 1940s? Or a chemical plant in a resilient coastal town?
Yeah, why does it matter today?
Because this deep dive proves that the hardest, most resilient toxin to eliminate isn't radiation or heavy metals. It is the playbook of hypocrisy. This triad of silence, corruption, and disinformation wasn't left behind in the Cold War. It was optimized.
Absolutely.
It is a warning to look closely at the narratives surrounding industrial safety and environmental impact in our own backyards. When a massive corporation or a local government assures you that a localized spill is contained, or that the strange spike in local illnesses is just a statistical anomaly, history demands that we ask deeper questions.
Like, who is actually conducting the tests?
Right. Where's the data? And most importantly, who profits from the silence?
The entire system relies on our collective willingness to look away once the initial shock wears off. They rely on us treating disasters as finite, explosive events rather than the quiet, generational, slow burns they actually are.
We tend to want our disasters to have clear boundaries, a beginning, a middle, and an end. But today we've learned that the most dangerous devastation isn't the explosion itself. It's the invisible shockwave of toxins and administrative lies that quietly travels through generations.
Very well said.
So we want to leave you with a final thought to mull over as you go about your day. Think about the water you drank this morning. Think about the massive, sprawling industrial park you might drive past on your commute, the one with the manicured lawns and the safety-first signs. How much of our modern convenience, the batteries we use, the chemicals in our products, the energy that powers our homes is built on forgotten, localized compromises?
Yeah.
What invisible legacies might be hiding right now behind a polished Best in Sector award in your own community? Keep asking the hard questions, keep looking past the PR, and thank you for taking the deep dive with us today.